I never told my mom's new husband that I used to be attached to a U.S. Navy SEAL Special Operations team. To him, I was just a quiet daughter who stayed out of family business. My mom hadn't had a single happy day since she married Richard Caldwell. He controlled every penny she owned, cut her off from her friends, and convinced himself he was completely untouchable. When my mom finally built up the courage to file for divorce, Richard snapped. He thought he could bully her into backing down by showing up unannounced, making threats, and forcing his way into her life again. But my mom wasn't at her house. She was staying with me. Richard thought he was walking in to corner a terrified, defenseless family. He picked the wrong house. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Evelyn Montgomery. I'm 34 years old, and for 8 long years, my life belonged to the United States Navy. The last 4 of those years were spent attached to an elite special operations unit, a high-pressure world working alongside Navy SEALs where weakness wasn't an option, and situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. When my contract finally ended, I hung up my uniform, packed my gear, and made the long drive back to my quiet hometown in California. I was looking forward to decompression, home-cooked meals, and catching up with my mother, Margaret. What I came home to, however, was not the peaceful haven I remembered. During my final deployment overseas, my mother had met and married a man named Richard Caldwell. On paper, Richard was a successful independent real estate consultant. In reality, he was a master of slow, methodical psychological control. Within months of signing the marriage certificate, he had systematically dismantled every pillar of my mother's independence. It started small, taking over her personal bank accounts under the guise of simplifying household finances. Then came the subtle isolation, convincing her to drop out of her local gardening club run by her old rival Carol, encouraging her to stop taking calls from her lifelong friends, and gradually convincing her that she couldn't make sound financial decisions without his approval. Margaret had gone from a vibrant, confident woman to walking on eggshells in her own living room, terrified of triggering Richard's cold, patronizing temper. He treated her like an incompetent dependent rather than a partner. But worst of all, Richard looked at me, a daughter who preferred to keep her head down, listen quietly, and observe from the shadows, and assumed I was just as soft, clueless, and easily intimidated as he thought my mother was. He had no idea who I actually was. The full reality of the situation hit me during my first Sunday dinner at their house. The atmosphere inside the dining room was stifling, thick with an unspoken tension that made every bite of food feel like lead. Richard sat at the head of the table like a petty monarch reigning over a tiny, miserable kingdom. Throughout the meal, he made a point of dominating the conversation, delivering unsolicited lectures on market investments and proper household management. Every time my mother attempted to contribute a thought or speak about her own life savings, Richard would softly chuckle, shake his head, and interject with a smooth, patronizing tone that dripped with condescension. "Now, Margaret, sweetheart, let's leave the complex financial matters to people who actually understand how money works," he said, patting her hand in a way that felt more like a leash than an affection. My mother immediately went quiet, casting her eyes down toward her plate, completely defeated. Then, Richard turned his calculating gaze toward me. He asked condescending questions about my post-military plans, assuming I was just a lost, naive girl with no practical real-world skills. I kept my answers short, polite, and completely unrevealing. In my unit, the first rule of tactical engagement was simple: never interrupt an enemy when they are making a mistake. Richard believed he was the smartest, most dangerous man in the room. I let him believe it, silently taking mental notes of every passive-aggressive comment and calculated maneuver he made. The breaking point arrived 3 weeks later, hidden inside a stack of unopened mail on Richard's desk. While Richard was out of town attending a real estate conference, my mother finally gathered the courage to look through his filing cabinet. What she found turned her blood cold. Richard had been quietly opening new credit lines under her name, liquidating her private retirement fund managed by her longtime financial advisor Patricia, and slowly transferring the capital into a shell corporation registered solely to him. He was systematically stripping her of every safety net she possessed, preparing to leave her financially ruined. Trembling, Margaret showed me the bank statements. The look of quiet desperation in her eyes was all I needed to see. The time for passive observation was officially over. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Pack your essential documents, your clothing, and anything you can't replace. You're coming home with me tonight." Under the cover of darkness, while the house was completely empty, we packed her life into the trunk of my car. I drove her straight to my residence in the neighboring town, securing her safely inside my home. Early the next morning, we met with a top-tier family law attorney, Daniel Price. My mother officially signed the divorce petition drafted by Daniel and placed an immediate emergency freeze on all joint bank accounts and assets. For the first time in years, Richard was completely cut off from the money he had stolen, and his absolute control over my mother was instantly shattered. The reaction from Richard Caldwell was immediate and explosive. The moment his card was declined at his hotel and he received notice of the frozen accounts, his illusion of total control completely shattered. By late afternoon, his frantic text messages had escalated into explicit, furious voice notes left on my mother's phone. When he realized that she wasn't responding and wasn't at her primary residence, it didn't take his arrogant mind long to figure out where she had gone. Around 8 o'clock that evening, the heavy silence inside my home was broken by the sound of a vehicle slamming into my driveway, tires screeching against the gravel. A few seconds later came the violent, thunderous banging on my front door. Richard was screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that Margaret open up, hand over her signature to unfreeze the funds, and stop playing stupid games. He was furiously rattling the brass door handle, attempting to force his way inside through sheer intimidation. My mother shrank back into the hallway, her hands shaking violently, consumed by the familiar paralysis of fear that Richard had spent years cultivating in her. I gently placed a hand on her shoulder, looked her in the eyes, and told her to step into the back bedroom and lock the door behind her. I didn't raise my voice. My heart rate didn't even spike. In my 4 years with special operations, I had faced armed insurgents and high-stress tactical extractions. A frantic, middle-aged narcissist throwing a temper tantrum on a porch didn't even register as a threat. I took a deep, deliberate breath, walked calmly down the hallway, and unlocked the front door. When I pulled the door open, Richard didn't even hesitate. His face was flushed crimson, eyes wide with unbridled rage, as he tried to use his full physical weight to push past me into the entryway. "Get out of my way, Evelyn!" he barked, his voice filled with venom as he reached out and grabbed the edge of the doorframe to force his entry. "Where is she? Tell your mother to get out here right now before I make both of your lives a living hell." He mistook my silence and relaxed posture for total surrender. He had no idea that every muscle in my body was already primed for immediate tactical execution. Before his foot could even clear the threshold, I stepped smoothly inside his center of gravity. In one fluid, practiced movement, I caught his reaching wrist, pivoted my hip, and applied pressure directly to his joint leverage point. The physical response was instant and absolute. Richard didn't even have time to register what was happening before his balance was completely broken. With a sharp gasp of shock, he went crashing hard onto his knees against the entryway floor, his arm pinned securely behind his back in a non-lethal, inescapable restraint lock. I leaned in close to his ear, keeping my voice dangerously quiet, calm and steady. "Listen to me very carefully, Richard," I said, holding him completely motionless with a fraction of my effort. For 8 years, I served in the United States Navy, attached to a Special Operations SEAL unit. I have disarmed real threats in actual combat zones. You are an arrogant bully who picked the absolute wrong house to make threats tonight. If you move even a single inch, I will break this arm." Richard went entirely rigid, all the color draining from his face, as absolute terror finally replaced his rage. As Richard knelt on the entryway floor, hyperventilating in complete shock, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night air. I had dialed emergency services the second I heard his tires screeching into my driveway. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing against the trees. The officers rushed up the steps, weapons at the ready, only to find a calm woman holding a terrified, groaning man pinned to the floor with effortless precision. I immediately identified myself, explained the situation, and stepped back as the officers handcuffed Richard and placed him in the back of a squad car. But I didn't stop there. While Richard was sitting in the holding cell, I handed the lead investigator a meticulously compiled binder, the same paper trail my mother, Daniel Price, Patricia, and I had pulled together. It contained bank statements proving unauthorized wire transfers, records of forged credit applications, and saved voice recordings of his explicit extortion attempts and physical threats. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence of financial fraud and domestic harassment, Richard's confidence evaporated. When the divorce proceedings reached the courtroom 2 months later, his legal team saw the writing on the wall. Facing potential grand larceny charges and felony fraud indictments if the case went to a jury trial, Richard folded completely. He signed a comprehensive settlement agreement, forfeiting every single claim to my mother's assets, returning every dollar he had transferred out of her accounts, and accepting a permanent court-ordered restraining order that barred him from coming within 1,000 feet of either of us. With Richard Caldwell completely out of the picture, life finally returned to my mother's world. She used her recovered assets to move into a quiet, sunlit home, reconnected with Carol and her old garden club friends, and reclaimed the bright, independent spirit she'd lost during those dark years. Standing up to a bully isn't just about physical strength. It's about refusing to let control and manipulation dictate your life. Thank you for following my story to the end. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from.